Good morning in Washington. Good afternoon in Europe, whether we're talking about Kiev or Moscow. Good evening in Irkutsk. My name is John Herbst, and I run the Eurasia Center at the Atlantic Council. We have an event today on the future of Russia and what that might mean for American foreign policy. We planned this weeks ago before the world heard the name Mr. Pregosian. That will certainly have an impact on our discussion today. And we've got a wonderful set of speakers for you. We have Dylan Miles Primakov from NED. We have Yevhen Libovitsky, partner in ProMuva and a long-term civil society activist in Ukraine. We have Tatiana Dugar-Dupont, who's the secretary of the Executive Committee of the Free Nations League. And we have Steven Sestanovich, who is both a senior fellow at the CFR, Council on Foreign Relations, and a professor of international diplomacy at Columbia University. So again, thank you all for joining us. And I will ask questions of our panelists, and then we will have audience questions. So, Ms. Dugar-Dupont, what conclusions do you draw about the strength and the viability of the Putin government from the Pregosian affair? Does this foreshadow major changes?
Well, first of all, Wagner mutiny has shown how thin Russia's defenses are. Rostov-on-Don was captured without firing a single shot. Not a single tank was brought forward to stop Pregosian's march. For the most part, the regular army, the police, the Russian National Guards stood back and watched while a gang of mercenaries dashed towards Moscow. The mutiny gravely undermined Putin's leadership. Russia's president has been humiliated. Lukashenko now plays the role of the president of Russia, obviously. Putin has been shown up as weak. In his address to the Russian people on Saturday morning, he denounced Pregosian's betrayal and vowed a harsh punishment. However, the charges against Pregosian have been dropped, despite the fact that people were shot dead, 6 helicopters and 2 planes were shot down by Wagner mercenaries on their way to Moscow. Holding off purges, Putin signals that he's not confident his orders will be followed, and that will embolden plotters. In Putin's world, ruled by the values of organized crime, powerful leaders do not let people off. The state no longer has monopoly on violence. Russian society has received a clear signal. If you are a silovik or owner of a private military company, you can organize an armed rebellion, kill Russian servicemen, shoot down military aircraft, threaten the Minister of Defense, but they will let you safely leave for a neighboring country. However, if you stand on the street with a piece of paper that says no to war, you will be accused of discrediting the army and put in jail. The police and the National Guard are powerless against those who can fight back. They can only beat senior citizens and students protesting against the war. As for the fate of Wagner, it is now excommunicated from the financial floors of the Russian Federation for obvious reasons. The result of Pregosian's campaign to date is that the most capable part of the Russian army, which was not formally part of it, will conclude contracts with the Ministry of Defense and turn into another inefficient structure of the Russian armed forces. So, the mutiny has inflicted severe damage on Putin and his war and brought the regime that is now being held together by mere inertia to the brink of collapse.
Thank you very much. But I have one quick follow-up question. I think the analysis is superb. Do you believe this is widely understood in Russia?
I think that it is understood by a large part of Russian citizens. You don't see a lot of public discussion because, of course, for obvious reasons, it is impossible in Russia. But many people, of course, see what is happening and they make their conclusions.
Thank you. Okay. Dylan, the Kremlin announced that the charges against Pregosian are dropped, as we just heard, and he agreed to depart for Belarus. There are indications his plane is there, although not clear evidence, I think, that he is there. Meantime, the New York Times reports this morning that General Surovikin knew that Prigozhin was going to march. So my question for you is this: is Prigozhin done as a political actor and a leader of Wagner? And can Putin afford to actually punish Prigozhin, even surreptitiously?
Thanks, John. So I think it's for sure too soon to say that Prigozhin is done as a political actor. I think it's important to remember how much we don't know about this situation right now. And kind of underlining that, we saw a lot of very quick reactions, a lot of categorical statements while all of this was underway this weekend that turned out to prove false pretty quickly as things developed in an unexpected, a lot of unexpected directions. So in terms of the deal that Putin and Prigozhin and Lukashenko have made, we have, not to put a too fine a point on it, three inveterate liars as sources of information about this: Prigozhin, Putin, and Lukashenko. None of them renowned for their honesty. So we don't know what the terms of this deal are. We don't know what the future of Wagner is, how many servicemen will follow Prigozhin to Belarus. John, as you said, we don't know if Prigozhin is actually in Belarus yet. And as Radyana pointed to, the Russian state is a major part of how Wagner operates. People, it's often pointed out that describing Wagner as a private military corporation isn't entirely accurate. It was created by the GRU. It has, throughout its the course of its existence, gotten not just funding from the GRU, but also its weaponry, its logistics. It's unclear to what extent that is being cut off, or whether the Russian government might keep Wagner on to play some of the roles it's been playing that pose less of a direct security threat to Russia. Lavrov was quoted saying that Wagner's activities in Africa in particular will continue. So I think it's too soon to say that Wagner as a force is going to disappear, or that Prigozhin as a political actor is done. However, I think it's also too soon to say that Prigozhin got away with this or got the better of Putin here. I think Prigozhin's leverage vis-a-vis Putin kind of peaked on Saturday when he was 200 kilometers outside, when Wagner troops are 200 kilometers outside of Moscow. And we've seen many examples of how Putin can be patient and go after enemies slowly over time. I'm thinking about 10 years ago, Alexei Navalny was first sentenced to prison for 5 years. Thousands of Russians turned out in the streets in Moscow and around Russia. The next day, Navalny's sentence was magically changed to a suspended sentence. He walked out of jail and was allowed to run for mayor of Moscow a couple months later. That did not mean that Putin was giving up, or that Alexei Navalny had won this conflict with Putin. As we all know, over the subsequent years, Navalny was subject to ongoing and escalating attacks up to the point of an assassination attempt, and now it looks like de facto life imprisonment. So Putin is capable of playing the long game against his enemies as well, and could certainly go after Prigozhin again should the opportunity present itself. And I think that's something, as much as this weekend's events have shaken the Russian elite and and Putin's regime, I think everyone within Russia's elite is aware of that. And, the more prudent people are not hastening to draw conclusions.
But from what you've said, it sounds like you believe, but tell me if I'm wrong, that Putin must treat Prigozhin with caution, as opposed to satisfying a taste for vengeance now.
I think that's true. I think, he would prefer to maybe park this problem while he's dealing with, say, the Ukrainian counteroffensive. This has been, I think, a major distraction and something that has the potential to impact Russia's war effort. I can see why, for Putin, it would be very appealing to get Prigozhin out of the way for now and deal with it later.
Okay, thank you. Yevhen, I want to ask you about what impact, if any, this is having on the Ukrainian counteroffensive. But if you want to comment on what you think is happening in Russia, feel free to.
Well, it has little immediate effect on what's happening with the counteroffensive. Some of the military analysts are saying that there might be some effect vis-a-vis Russian military morale, but this is not something that will happen at instant. This is not something that I think will define the situation on the battlefield. But if we are looking at the Russian situation, we've seen how fragile Russia is. And this is the reminder of regimes like Putin's. They look very strong until they aren't. And this is exactly what we have to be ready for. We have to be ready for a instant change in Russia. Coup is possible, quick change to quick policy change is possible, everything is possible. And in that sense, the question is how ready the United States, the Western countries, Ukraine, and other partners involved are ready, how quickly they can change their policy towards Russia. And this is, I think, a good test call because what we see is that there was a fascination with the events developing so fast and so unexpectedly. But we should also think of the unthinkable. And in that sense, I think a lot of policy reviews should follow, including what the future Russian status will be. Should Russia stay nuclear? Should Russia be allowed in the clubs where Russia is still a member, including the UN Security Council? And these questions have had their very obvious responses a year ago. I think it's time to review these answers.
Okay, thank you. Steve, what conclusions should Western policymakers draw from this affair, and what impact, if any, should it have on U.S. policy towards Russia? But also, feel free to comment on what you think is going on, because I know you're a close student of Russia.
Okay, let me say a word about that, and then about U.S. policy. I am with Dylan on not drawing too rapid conclusions ahead of what we know. And what we don't know is a lot here. I think it is probably a mistake to exaggerate the divisions within the Russian national security establishment. This has obviously been a huge jolt for them, and sorting it out is going to take some time, some political decisiveness, at which Putin has not shown himself to be very good. But he's got a very, very strong interest in radiating normalcy and stability. And that means he has obviously decided that means not going after Pregosian too energetically. It may mean not going after anybody who was any sort of sympathizer, because Putin's real goal here is to make sure that the danger that Prigozhin represented on Friday and Saturday, which is civil war, does not materialize as a result of his own, Putin's actions. Now, about Western policy, and U.S. policy in particular, the focus of American policy this week should be what it was last week, which is figuring out how to promote the success of Ukraine in its confrontation with Russia. And from my point of view, almost anything else is a distraction. I'm happy to read Yevgen's policy papers about stripping Russia of its nuclear weapons or its membership in the UN Security Council, but I don't expect very much to come from those. whereas the United States does have real options in its policies toward Ukraine. Should it accelerate NATO membership for Ukraine? Should it deepen the commitment of military equipment, intelligence, and training to Ukraine? What can it do to divide Russians and to increase doubts about this entire enterprise on the part of the Russian leadership? And what detracts from success in this confrontation, Ukraine's success, but also the success of Western governments in supporting Ukraine, what detracts from that is not good policy. What enhances the prospect for success is where we ought to be focused. And I'll give you one particular implication that comes out of the Pregosian affair. You know, Pregosian is not talking about this too much now because he's trying not to bring down Putin's wrath on himself. But he began this entire episode with a bold truth-telling about the war, which is that it was based on lies. And although he didn't say it was Putin's lies, he said they were the lies of General Shoigu and General Gerasimov. Everybody knows that that isn't true. Anybody who listened to Pregosian knows that what he meant was Putin got us into this mistaken war. So this is, and that it's based on all kinds of wrong calculations. Ukraine was not going to attack Russia, NATO was not threatening Russia, and so forth. Drawing out the implications of that seems to me very important, and exploiting this moment of truth-telling is something that should be a high priority. You know, I think on this score, Western governments, while they've been reluctant to take sides in this confrontation in Moscow, and appropriately so, have probably been overly reticent in commenting on this claim of Pregosian's. It is easy and right to say this is an internal fight in Russia, but what one should add to that is the Russian people have heard something immensely important and truthful for a change. Secretary Blinken did acknowledge this in his comments over the weekend, but it should be more prominent. Last thing, we shouldn't, and this is where I started, we shouldn't exaggerate the turmoil that's occurring in Moscow. This is a turmoil within a very small elite, and Putin is a little bit weakened. Yes, that's okay, and it's also okay for much of the Russian elite. They don't mind having Putin a little bit weakened. That gives them a little more breathing room. But it is important in this period to keep focused on what is the main test of success for American policy, and that is Ukraine's success in the war.
Thank you. Rodiana, I have a large question for you, but before I give that one to you, I'd like to follow up on what Steve just mentioned. And I have a small question for you. Like Steve, I was struck by Pregosian's Friday statement saying that the reasons offered by the Russian government for the large invasion were lies. Do you think that is well understood in Russia, or better understood now as a result of Pregosian's statement?
Well, I think that Russian people are actually used to living these double lives. When you know, it's actually since the Soviet times when you are being fed, you know, one information, but then you discuss something, in a very narrow circle, and you are saying something contradictory to the propaganda. But at the same time, when you go to the public meeting, you unanimously vote for what you are, told to vote for. And that's how the society is working right now. And everyone really understands that, it's been a great lie. Some people actually tend to believe with time, because I think it's just psychological mechanism of coping with this. You cannot just live in lie. You need to believe it so that you can function, really. But this is not natural for human nature to function like that for a long time.
Thank you. Okay, Steve, I have a quick question for you following up, and then we'll go back to the regular questions. One of the things you mentioned you think U.S. policymakers should be doing is, in a sense, trying to sow doubt in Russia.
Yeah.
Now, with that in mind, again, I referred to the article in the New York Times on Sorovikin's relationship with Pregosian. Might that have been briefed by U.S. intel or Western intel precisely for the reasons you just described?
Look, I think it's great to, set these people against each other. They've got plenty of reasons to do that. This is going to be a complicated issue for Putin. How many people does he try to punish, and on what grounds? And is he doing it because they represent a real threat to him, or because he just wants to show that he's the boss again and nobody should mess with him? My inclination, I talked to a Russian friend just an hour before we came on, and he said, punishing one or two generals might be good. Punishing too many of them would be a mistake. Because it raises the prospect of spreading threats, which will make people think maybe they have to look out for themselves rather than count on Putin to manage the system in a stable enough way that they benefit. So this is a choice that Putin faces. It's going to be important for him to find the balance between looking strong and assertive and looking vengeful and crazy. That's a balance that all tyrants have to find in some way. I'm not sure that our ability to play with the calculations of people in the inner circle is very great. But I think we do have, as I was saying earlier, an opportunity to sow more doubt about the basic logic of the war, and to kind of rebut the crazy claims that Putin has made about the way in which the United States is trying to break up Russia and wants to destroy it. It's inconvenient to the West to have Russia, so it needs to be dismantled. That sort of thing. On that, I think public diplomacy can have some effective role, and we're not trying.
Great, thank you. Rodiana, you're known for your strong views on Russia's future. How do you see that future, and what, in your view, should the West's long-term policy towards Russia be?
The defeat of Russia in the war with Ukraine is a matter of time. And I perfectly understand the desire of the civilized world to surround defeated Russia by a powerful wall and a moat with crocodiles, and to leave these barbarians to their fate. But it doesn't work like that. So I would like to assess some of the potential scenarios of the future of Russia and determine the most reasonable one for the Russia and the world. One such potential scenario can be a palace coup, It could lead to conflicts among the competing elites, including military ones. Russian opposition leaders, hoping to seize the power after the collapse of the regime, have neither a long-term political program nor a plan for successfully conducting the first democratic elections. Russia is functioning because the propaganda and siloviki, which is the army, the police, law enforcement, secret services, hold it together. Once the liberal government proclaims the thaw, the system will fall apart. This has been the pattern in the Russian history for at least 2 centuries. The reign of liberal Alexander I had ended with the Decembrist uprising and the coming of the hardcore reactionary Nicholas I. His son, Tsar Liberator Alexander II, was assassinated by revolutionaries, which had deeply traumatized his son and heir Alexander III, and so on, until more recent examples of the fall of Soviet and Russian liberals in power, Khrushchev, Gorbachev, and Yeltsin. In a clash between the liberals and the war hawks, the latter would win since they hold real power. The rise of hawks or failed anti-Putin coup would lead to preserving the current imperial system and re-escalating the war in Ukraine. This scenario may occur if the West would strive to keep Russia unified at any cost. Another realistic scenario is the parade of sovereignties, in which national republics assert their independence, fueling Russian imperial chauvinism and eventually leading to a civil war. The uncontrolled process of collapse brings unacceptable risks of nuclear weapon proliferation and humanitarian crisis. Thus, both scenarios of consolidation of imperial power and dissolution of imperial power are equally unacceptable. And moreover, China is strengthening its position in both scenarios. Consolidated weakened Russia is becoming its satellite, and collapsed Russia passes on its resources to China. The only type of plan to ensure sustainable global peace seems to be the controlled dissolution or reconstruction of post-imperial space. An example of such was the peaceful dissolution of the USSR into independent states in 1991. A series of steps is required to increase the chance of positive change in post-Russia. First, support should be given to the independence movements of the captured nations of the Russian Empire and withdrawn from the Russian liberal, in quotes, opposition, which denies the right of peoples to self-determination. As was explained earlier, the empowering of the latter will lead only to either the scenario of consolidation of the hawks or the scenario of chaos. Diplomatic relations should be built with the newly independent states in advance. The neighboring and culturally related countries such as Ukraine, the Baltic states, Kazakhstan, Mongolia, Turkey, and the global leaders must be interested to take part in the reconstruction of ex-Russia in order to sustain their interests and expand influence. Secondly, it is necessary to explain to Western societies that the risks of the continuation of the war and the risks of uncontrolled chaos in Russia are unacceptable. And thus, the only option is the controlled reconstruction of a post-imperial space based on the basic principles and documents of the United Nations. Thirdly, the world community should insist on key reconstruction principles based on the United Nations ones: denuclearization, peaceful resolution of disputes, protection of rights for all citizens, and accountability for war crimes. These principles are already included in the Declaration on the Decolonization of Russia, signed by the leaders of the national liberation movements united in the Free Nations League. The captive nations have to be given the opportunity for self-determination and free choice of their geopolitical vector. Thank you.
Just one quick follow-up. It seems to me, but maybe I'm wrong, that you're suggesting these are things that will happen because of dynamics within Russia, as opposed to being imposed or sought with great energy from outside. Is that correct?
I don't quite understand the
In other words,
question.
the scenarios you just laid out, especially the last one, is it your view this will come as a result of activities of the peoples within what's currently called the Russian Federation?
Well, of course, these processes will be will include also the efforts will be also by the people who are from Russia but currently are not in Russia.
All
Of
right.
course, it's like it will be combined processes of the like happening inside Russia and outside of Russia.
Right. Okay. Thank you. All right. Dylan, I had a question for you, which I will ask, but if you feel free to comment on what John has said. So if the Kremlin loses the war in Ukraine, which I think it will as long as Western support stays where it is, or it becomes stronger, what type of future do you see for Russia? And what should the West's long-term policy be towards Russia?
Yeah, that's a tough question. I think I think you're right that the Kremlin is on track to lose this war, barring any major changes. And I think in some ways they already have, and what's left is to secure a victory and a peaceful, secure future for Ukraine. That said, there's still a lot of different scenarios in play for how this might end. And of course, depending on which one of those comes to be, the political impact on Russia will be very different. So I could certainly see a scenario that many people are rooting for, a scenario where Ukraine is able to restore full sovereignty over its internationally recognized 1991 borders. I'm not convinced that that scenario would lead to a good political impact in Russia. I am frankly pretty pessimistic about what comes next in Russia, no matter what. I think what we saw this weekend shows that there is a real constituency in Russia that is dissatisfied with things right now, not because Putin started the war, but because Russia isn't fighting the war better. And I don't think those people are going to go away just because Russia loses this war. To Radiana's point, I think that real meaningful political change in Russia is going to have to come from inside Russia, and that those of us in the US and the West and the rest of the world need to be very modest in our assessments of what international policy can do to shape events inside Russia. The idea of Russian denuclearization, the splitting up of Russia into different countries, that to me sounds like a scenario that would require essentially a military occupation of Moscow by a foreign power, which I do not think is in the cards. I think a more realistic scenario, the realistic best case scenario, would be a reformer type figure coming perhaps from within the system. I think it's certainly possible, as we've seen, Putin's hold on power has become shakier as a result of this disastrous Ukraine policy he's been pursuing. I do think that opens up some space for a figure who maybe in the path of someone like Gorbachev or Yeltsin rises within the system without a particular, strong profile as a liberal reformer, then when in office responds to circumstances and opportunities to implement significant reforms. I think one potential direction would be for someone from inside the system who's seen as more of a systemic liberal, someone like Moscow Mayor Sobyanin, someone like Prime Minister Mishustin. These are people who are not highly associated with the war. They have not been part of the party of war. They're not out there making aggressive statements constantly like Dmitry Medvedev or other figures like that. Those are figures where if the Russian elite decides that it's in its collective interest to try to repair relations with the West to a certain extent, those could be people the system wants to put forward as the face of Russia, looking in a different direction. I would still be very skeptical in that scenario about this potential for positive change. As we've seen over the weekend, there's still, the people in Russia who control the bulk of the country's military assets are the security services and the army. And I don't think there's any kind of ideological split with Putin over the war coming from those directions. I think in terms of Western policy, again, I think the prudent thing for Western policy is to be aware of the limitations on the impact we can have, to try to aim for a process of gradual reform from within, supporting those Russian actors who would like to see a more democratic and peaceful future for their country. But it's not going to be something that we're going to be able to dictate to the Russians, no matter how this war ends. And I think realistically, where we can have the most impact is through security assistance to Ukraine, both helping them win this war and making a lasting, durable, long-term commitment that will, over time, persuade Russian leadership of the futility of a policy of ongoing aggression towards Ukraine. But that's, again, something that's going to have to come from within Russia.
Thank you. Yevhen, what sort of Russia would Ukraine like to see in the future? And what will Ukraine's long-term policy towards Moscow be?
Well, long-term policy is from effective survival through sustainable containment towards managed decolonization. This has to stop because Russia has been a threat to its neighbors, to the world, not for the last year and a half, not for the last decades. It's been like that for centuries. We have to stop it. And the resolve is there in Ukraine, and it's imprinted in long-term policy. So what we basically see is that the Ukrainian policy will probably not change much towards Russia, regardless of who's winning the elections. Decolonizing Russia, yes, it does mean the change of borders. Yes, it does mean the new states. And this is exactly where I feel the discourse of our today's conversation, like the discourse towards the breakup of the Soviet Union in the United States in late 80s. It's already there, it's brewing, but we keep our eyes wide shut. The events are happening, and they are inconvenient, and they're inconvenient for the administration, they're inconvenient for the businesses, they're inconvenient for many players. We will have to adjust, everyone will have to adjust, and it's not going to be easy, and it's going to be messy. And probably we're not talking about, the new states happily going into the sunset. Probably their rise will be messy. Probably we're not talking about the national movements being capable of taking it into their hands. Probably it will be the Putin's appointed bureaucracy that at certain point of uncertainty would decide that their time has come and they have to go ahead. So we have to be ready for that. Ukraine has the optics that allow to see Russia in great detail. That might actually equip the Western alliance as well to partner with Ukraine on their Russian policy. We don't see that happening at this point. Let me remind that the US ended up trailing behind in the events in 1991 with a humiliatingly wrong tone of the Chicken Kyiv speech in 1991. President Bill Clinton is now right to regret the US stance on Budapest Memorandum in 1994. So let's not continue to accumulate policies that we will be sorry about in years to come. Nuclear Russia is a problem. Centralized Russia is a problem. Russia in partnership with Iran and China is a problem. Colonialism is a problem in Russia, but also elsewhere in the world. So we have to address the issue, and that means the need for fundamental policy review, first of all in the United States, but then also across the Western alliances.
Yes, and just to confirm, though, you're saying these changes are going to come no matter what's on the mind of Western policymakers, correct?
Exactly.
Okay.
And that means that we basically have to adjust to something that will be happening on the ground, regardless whether we support it or not.
Okay, thank you. Steve, there's a lot of speculation, of course, of what a post-Putin Russia would look like. What do you anticipate allowing for different leadership possibilities in Moscow? And again, what impact would this have? What should our policy be?
John, I'm going to answer that question, but I want to pick up on one historical analogy which has gotten mentioned a couple of times.
Please.
In this season, historical analogies are what we all trade in because we don't have too much information. So it's great to go back and recall this czar or that prince who was strangled by somebody or stabbed by somebody else, and Russian history as a result took a great turn. The Soviet breakup was, it is important to remember, even though Yevgen is right, the president of the United States was ambivalent about it. It was supported by Russia's leaders. And that was what made it possible and peaceful. Which raises the question, what kind of situation could one imagine in which Russia's leaders would want to renegotiate their relationship with non-Russian nations that are within the Russian Federation? I don't have an answer, a full answer to that question. It would certainly presume, I think, a kind of democratic reorientation of Russian politics. But I think one answer is don't make Russians feel that losing the war in Ukraine prejudges all of these other issues. Russians who want to challenge the war in Ukraine should not be obliged to answer the criticism that in doing so, Russia will inevitably break up. We want Russians who oppose the war in Ukraine to be able to speak up and say, we're against this because it is completely crazy and bad for Russia. A future Russian leadership. A Russian friend of mine says, look, the kinds of changes that one can imagine in the Russian leadership these days as a result of Putin's weakness, the divisions within the national security establishment, and so on, those are not bringing us closer to democracy, only bringing us closer to the next dictatorship, which unfortunately is probably not a bad prediction. It's certainly one that can be supported by a lot of historical analogies. Let me say, though, that without being able to specify the composition of a future Russian leadership or of its democratic foundations and so forth, what are the big policy choices that will face, that a new leadership will face? Whether it's by somebody running instead of Putin next year, or a palace coup, or Putin's sudden mortality. The big choice that Russians will face that a new leadership will face is how to repair the wreckage of their policy toward Europe. How to overcome the isolation that they've created for themselves through this war, how to bring an end to sanctions. And in thinking about that and in trying to explore those possibilities, we don't want a new Russian leadership to think that they can get there easily, that they can have it on the cheap without making major adjustments in their policy, certainly not without full respect for Ukrainian sovereignty. But we also don't want them to think it's impossible. And so this is a question that will be on the minds of Russian leaders, is if they move toward trying to overcome their isolation, what can they expect the reciprocation from the West to be? Remember, it was important in the evolution of Gorbachev's policies and reformism that he came to think he faced both a Western leadership, and particularly an American president, who was extremely rigid and uncompromising in negotiations, and broadly interested in a kind of new relationship with the Soviet Union that allowed an opportunity for Soviet modernization and reform. Gorbachev he dealt with a very tough Reagan and a very accommodating Reagan. And a future Russian leadership needs to face both of those possibilities.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, we now have audience questions. And the first one is from Ira Strauss. And it's, how concerned should the West be about keeping Russia in the current circumstances, possibly unraveling in some fashion, or at least changes of leadership in some fashion? How should the West be concerned about Russia keeping control of its nuclear weapons? Steve, want to give that a shot?
I'm not too worried about Russian control of their nuclear weapons, to be honest. I don't mean to seem kind of flip about this. Yeah. Obviously, nobody on this panel wants, nobody anywhere wants Russian nuclear weapons to go missing. Certainly after the breakup of the Soviet Union, that was a very, very high priority for Western policy, and appropriately so. I would remind people, though, that it sometimes led to policy mistakes. I think it was Yevhen who mentioned the Budapest Memorandum. We were so obsessed with having Ukraine give up its nuclear weapons, which, by the way, I think was good for Ukraine, very good for Ukraine, that we didn't think enough about what the broader policy should be, which is how to make Ukraine stronger. And I think that's it's important that as we think about loose nukes, we also think more broadly about other policy interests that we have to advance in creating a relationship that is positive and advances our interests.
Okay, thank you. We have another question.
And I see Yevhen wants to.
Oh, please, Yevhen, go ahead.
With something I've said.
Please, Yevhen.
Yes, I would like to say that, with all due respect, I think it was right that Ukraine was relieved of nuclear weapons, but I do not think that it was right to keep the nuclear weapons with Russia. Nuclear weapons have debilitated the Russian society's ability to transform itself. It was a clear loss in the Cold War, and that was the price that Russia had to pay for this loss. But at that time, Russia was not viewed as a successor state to the Soviet Union, and that was a huge policy mistake. And the result of that policy mistake is the war that we're having right now. And if we will try and repeat the same mistake again, we will eventually have to face the consequences again. And I understand that I'm speaking also from the proximity point, because Ukraine will be probably the first to suffer, but it's global now. Look at the world markets, look at what's happening with gas, with oil, etc.
Thank you. We have a question about the opposition. How is the Russian opposition approaching turmoil in Russia? And what would be the most constructive kind of messaging for us to talk about this? Rajana and Dylan on this. Rajana, go first, please.
Well, actually, the Pregosian affair has demonstrated the inability of Russian liberal opposition to actually present a viable way out. For example, Khodorkovsky openly supported Prigozhin in it, and others were just in disarray and dismay. As for the national liberation and regionalist liberation movements, I would say that we have a clear path of how we are going to act in the circumstances that, for example, there is a window of opportunity for us to finally become independent. And also, I would like to comment about that view on Russian people in power. It's like Russia is always from afar seen as something monolithic, something unified, which is not true. Russia is very diverse, and it consists of various regions and national regions as well. And we have our own goals, our own values, our own image of our future. And for example, there are leaders when it was when somebody said that the Soviet Union was actually the dissolution was supported by Russian leaders, I would actually say that I lived through that period, and I remember that the movement for independence of the Baltic nations was not supported at all. It was actually suppressed. And they actually won their revolutions. And now the Baltic states are exemplary democratic states. They are members of the European Union. And for example, in national regions such as, for example, Tatarstan, Buryatia, where I'm from, the North Caucasus, national movements have ties with elites in the republic, not those like the heads of the republic who are actually war criminals, but I would say second tier, who actually reconsider their loyalty right now to the Russian state. And it's not that we are just sitting outside of Russia and waiting for the collapse to happen. No, we are thinking about how to act in this situation. And I don't think that I think that we need to be prepared for that event, because it can be like it was written in a book of Alexei Yovchak, the Soviet Union, it was forever, but then it was, it it just ended unexpectedly. And we need to be prepared for that.
Thank you. Okay, Dylan, do you want to comment on the same thing?
Sure. So I think, as Rodiana said, there was a kind of diverse reaction from kind of Russia's traditional opposition to these events. I think a lot of people were remarking on how it showed the weakness of the Putin regime and an opportunity as a result. As Rodiana said, some figures like Khodorkovsky came out in support of Pregosian, and I believe he said now that armed insurrection is the path to regime change in Russia. I think there's other parts of the opposition that are still maintaining a more democratic outlook. Navalny, for example, yesterday responded to this saying that regime change, political change in Russia must come at the ballot box. I think the wiser among Russia's opposition will recognize that an uprising like that started by Prigozhin is not ultimately going to be good for them. It is not going to create a path for a liberal democratic government in Russia. In terms of response from what Rodiana called national liberation movements. I guess those seeking greater autonomy or independence for Russia's ethnic republics. I didn't see any response there. I didn't see anyone inside Russia saying, you know, this is our moment, time for our people to rise up. And I'm skeptical that that would happen in a future instance of this. I also wanted to respond to a couple of people here who have brought up the dissolution of the Soviet Union and described that as a peaceful process. I think that's the wrong way to look at it. If you remember the fighting that broke out immediately in Transnistria and South Ossetia, Jaria, Abkhazia, then a few years later in Chechnya, and violence over the process of dissolution that continues today, frankly. I don't think the dissolution of the Soviet Union is fully complete yet. And Russia's imperial disintegration is an ongoing and violent process.
Yes, thank you. I think we have time for one more question, and both Toby Gaddy and Andrei Yakovlev have mentioned the global South. So Toby's question, it was for you, Steve, and she asked, is talk by the U.S. government and other countries of reconstructing Russia putting the cart before the horse? Should it be a priority for the administration to use what Pregosian said about the causes of the war, the lies, to shore up support among U.S. skeptics, especially in the global South? And again, Andrei Yakovlev also talks about the global South.
That's great. I can answer that question easily. Yes. Yeah. I mean, you know, the immediate priority is to make sure the war comes out in the right way. And for that purpose, we need to do, in the first instance, everything possible to strengthen Ukraine. And in the second instance, everything possible to maintain unity among Western governments and Ukraine's other supporters. And in the third instance, to divide Russians who have so far been too quiet about their doubts about the war. Somewhere in this set of instances, it's important, as the administration is trying to do, to take the edge off some of the sympathy that Russia has been able to garner for itself in the so-called global South. The administration has had some success in that effort, but it's been a difficult one because, you know, some governments have thought that there's an advantage for them in kind of playing both sides. You know, they get an opportunity to get cheaper Russian oil and so forth. That's a big incentive for the Indians. And there's not much that you're going to do through diplomacy to discourage the Indians from buying discounted Russian oil, except maybe to get them to drive a harder bargain and pay less for it. And that's all to the good. I think the place of the global South is worth watching in this struggle, but I think it's something that will sort itself out with the right outcome in Ukraine. I don't think this is going to turn out to be a really lasting coalition for the Russians if the war just ends badly for them and then they have to adjust. As I said earlier, I don't think the big policy question for a post-war Russian leadership is going to be, how do we deepen our support with countries in the global South? They will be able to do something in that direction. The big choice they face is, do they want to take a run at rebuilding their relationships with Europe and the United States? And from that point of view, we need a policy that gets the right outcome there.
Okay, Thank you, Steve. Thank you to all panelists. We're 2 minutes over. I'd like to thank our audience for tuning in. We'll be doing another event next week on the Pregosian affair on the 6th. Stay tuned, as well as an event on Belarus, what's going on there. So again, thanks everyone for tuning in. Thanks to our wonderful panelists, and we'll do this again.